Hello, and welcome to week 11 here of English 112 at Delta College. This week, we're going to be talking about revising and editing. This is going to be the third lesson. And as I've said before, it builds on the lessons that have come before. So this week, for revising, we're going to talk about how to revise conclusions and what conclusions need to do. And then for editing, we're going to talk about sentence structure issues and some common problems people run into when constructing sentences. So let's dive in. Okay, so conclusions. We need to start with the question of what is a conclusion? And most people get this wrong or they get confused about it because they've been given wrong information. Often when people take a writing class or the sort of advice that they get given is, write tell your audience what you're going to tell them, tell them it, and then tell them what you just told them. And so people think that the conclusion of an essay is a summary. It summarizes the argument that you just presented. And that's not true. There's no reason to summarize your argument because your reader has your argument right there in front of them. So they can read it for themselves. They don't need it summarized for them. So instead of being a summary, a conclusion is a summation. And that means you have to explain what everything adds up to. So it is the sum of the equation or the sum of the argument. So in the case of 2 plus 2, the sum would be 4. That would be the conclusion of that equation. And it's the same thing with an argument. With an argument, you have your connected series of statements, your evidence that you're putting forth to establish a thesis or a definite proposition. And the conclusion is that proposition. So you need to answer the question of so what in your conclusion. Why should your audience know or care about this information you just gave to them? What does it add up to? And I think a good way of conceptualizing the way a conclusion works is to think in terms of logic. And going back to the idea of syllogisms that we had talked about before, a syllogism is the most basic form of an argument that relies upon deductive reasoning. So if you have a couple of premises, the conclusion should logically follow from those. So x plus y should equal z. And in order for the argument or the conclusion to be valid, it has to logically follow from those premises. So the classic example that I've talked about before of a syllogism is all humans are mortal. That's the first premise. The second premise is Socrates was human. Therefore, Socrates must have been mortal. So that conclusion logically follows from those premises. So we can see how it adds up. So that would be a valid argument or a valid conclusion. And in order to test the validity of your conclusion, you should be able to work backwards to identify what the premises were and, in essence, solve for x. So if you know that, let's say, the sum is 4, then the premises should be some permutation of 2 plus 2. No, it doesn't have to be 2 plus 2 themselves. It could be 1 plus 1 plus 2, that would equal the same thing. But the idea is, in order to make sure that it's valid, you should be able to come up with a balanced equation or a balanced argument. So here's an example of a conclusion that comes from a student essay written by Jordan Brown for her English 112 class, A Word from My Anti-Phone Soapbox. And I've highlighted different phrases here which indicate what the subject, topic, and thesis are. So again, your conclusion doesn't summarize your argument. It is the summation, but you should be able to tell what those topics and subjects were, and then you should reach the conclusion of what it all adds up to. So, Earth to you, the people who never part from their cell phones. So we can tell that cell phones here is the topic that the writer is addressing. I'm sure you've taken several breaks while reading this rant to check your email and respond to a few texts. You probably missed most of the points of my argument too, much like you're missing what's going on in the world around you. So that's the thesis that the writer is trying to convey, is that people are so dependent upon their cell phones that they're ignoring or missing what's going on around them. Cell phones were initially meant to connect us, broadening the time frame during which people could communicate with one another. But with all the new apps being incorporated into these devices, isolation only grows, shrinking your world in perspective. You're all constantly talking and thinking about how you feel and what you think. You don't talk to Rachel or Steven, but to the Twitterverse or to Facebook at large. You communicate without any idea of who's really listening. And you should notice that this is incorporating several of those rhetorical strategies that we have talked about. 12 people preferred phone activities to talking to each other and me over 3-tiered red velvet cheesecake. Seriously, people, put those phones down. You're not thinking clearly. And that is the conclusion. That's the point that Jordan Brown is really trying to make here, that people need to put the phones down because they're not thinking clearly. So you can see how this represents the sum of the argument. Here's what it means. Here's what it all adds up to. Again, it answers that question. So what? Here's why it's important. And note as well that it's more than one paragraph. In this case, it's about a paragraph and a half, but it runs to longer than one paragraph. So just like introductions, conclusions don't have to be limited to one paragraph. And as I said with introductions, when you get into upper division courses or more sophisticated writing projects, if you're writing a 20-page research paper, one paragraph is not going to work for an introduction, and it's not going to work for a conclusion. So don't think in terms of paragraphs, but think in terms of sections. Okay, so let's switch over to editing now. So in the past, we've talked about punctuation errors and word errors. So we went from the smallest unit of meaning in writing to the next smallest unit. Now we're putting them together in sentences. So I want to talk about common sentence errors or issues that people run into. These consist of fragments, fused sentences, faulty parallelism, and passive voice. So a fragment is when you have an incomplete sentence. Remember that a sentence has to have 3 parts, a subject, a verb, and an object. With a fragment, at least one of those elements is missing. Fused sentences are the opposite. They used to be called run-on sentences. So these are sentences where you have more than a single subject, verb, and object. So they run on, in other words. So the technical term for those is fused sentence, and that includes comma splices. So a comma splice is when you have a fused sentence, in which case you've got 2 independent clauses or 2 complete thoughts that have been jammed together, and you put a comma where the fusion occurs. And we know that that's not correct because the rule for commas is you only use them when attaching dependent clauses to independent ones. So a fused sentence is when you've got more than one sentence jammed together without punctuation. A comma splice is when you've got them jammed together with a comma between them. Faulty parallelism is when you have a sentence construction that isn't consistent, that is not following the same pattern. So, for example, if you're writing by putting the subject before the verb, that's the pattern that you've established, then you need to keep to that pattern. If you're shifting verb tenses, then you're not being parallel. You're breaking that pattern. And then passive voice is kind of a tricky one because active voice is when you write by putting the actor before the action. So if you put your subject before your verb and your object after your verb, then that is active voice. You're focusing on the actor performing the action. The opposite is passive voice. That's when you put the object before the verb or the receiver of the action before the action itself. And the effect is to sound a little strange. And it doesn't sound natural to us because we naturally tend to speak in active voice. Although technically, passive voice is grammatically correct. And there are some situations when you will be required to use passive voice. So certain subjects, such as the physical sciences, or criminal science, or nursing and healthcare, those are all fields that require the use of passive voice. And the reason for that is because it is by definition objective. By putting the object before the verb, you are focusing on the object, and therefore you're being objective. So it implies a lack of judgment. You're just documenting what is seen or experienced. So, what is a sentence? Again, it's a subject, a verb, and an object, which is what makes up what's called the independent clause. So it is a thought that can stand on its own as a complete idea. So, for example, my experience as a camp counselor has taught me many lessons. In that case, my experience is the subject, taught is the verb, and the lessons is the object. That's what your experience taught you. So we call that a simple sentence. A simple sentence consists of a single subject, verb, and object. Complex sentences are when you have the independent clause, the subject, verb, and object, with an additional dependent clause. And the dependent clause is one that's missing either the subject, the verb, or the object. So it's a fragment. It's not complete. But you can create complex sentences by attaching the dependent clause to the independent one. And that's why you would use a comma. And then compound sentences are when you have a series of independent clauses that you want to combine. And you would typically do that through the use of a conjunction, like and, but, and or, one of those connecting words, or you can use a semicolon to do so. Okay, so fragments are dependent clauses. Again, they're missing one of the elements of the sentence, a subject, a verb, or an object. So, for example, the kind of lessons I cannot easily put into words. That's an example of a dependent clause because it cannot stand on its own as a complete thought. And the easiest way, well, in order to fix a fragment, you have to identify what the missing element is and then just supply the missing element. The easiest way to do that is to combine the fragment with the preceding or following sentence, because that is usually where the missing element is. So you would combine it, you would create a complex sentence by using a comma. Or technically, you could use a conjunction as well. So my experience as a camp counselor has taught me many lessons, the kind of lessons I cannot easily put into words. There you go. That's a complex sentence because it combines the independent clause with the dependent one, and it uses the comma to do so. So that's an easy way to fix a fragment, is to attach it to the preceding or following sentence. So fused sentences and comma splices. Again, a fused sentence is a run-on. It's when you have more than one complete thoughts or independent clauses that have been put together. So expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That is a fused sentence because you have two complete ideas that have just been combined without any punctuation. The comma splice is when you put the comma where that fusion occurs. So expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That's the comma splice. In order to fix fused sentences, and which includes comma splices, there are three ways. You can separate those clauses with a period, or you can combine those clauses with either a semicolon or a conjunction. So the first example, using the period, expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. That is a valid way of doing that. I don't particularly like that example because by using the period there, it feels a little too choppy to me. So personally, I would prefer to combine the clauses with the semicolon. Expanding the airport will generate more flights. More flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. And the reason why I prefer that is because that second clause continues and completes the thought of the first one. So for me, they naturally go together. You could also use a conjunction to create a similar effect. So expanding the airport will generate more flights, and more flights will bring more travelers and money into the region. Personally, I prefer the semicolon. That's just a personal preference, though. And I think it's because it's a little bit more concise because you're not using that extra word that the conjunction gives you. And that's just my personal preference. But either way will work. Faulty parallelism, like I said, this is when you shift the pattern that you've established. Maybe you're shifting verb tenses uh, or shifting voice, whatever it is. So, for example, as the temperature dropped, we moved our bedrolls closer to the fire, hung blankets over the windows, and more logs were added to the blaze. So, in this case, as the temperature dropped, that is being set up to be active voice. So the verb is dropped, so it's in past tense with an ed ending. What's dropping? The temperature. So that would be the actor in this particular case. So that's the subject of the sentence. And the subject is preceding that verb. So that pattern, as the temperature dropped, that pattern is active voice, past tense. So we need to maintain that pattern. So as the temperature dropped, we moved our bedrolls closer to the fire, hanged blankets over the windows, and added more logs to the blaze. Now, people get confused about hanged, and I understand why. That is one of those irregular verbs that in the past tense it has two forms. There is hung and hanged. What's the difference? Well, one is active, the other is passive. So hanged is the active form, whereas hung would be the passive form. And as we've said here, the pattern of the sentence is active voice. So we need to use the active form of the past tense of to hang, which is hanged. And then passive voice. Like I said, passive voice is grammatically correct. So it's not wrong necessarily, although it can sound really weird. So take, for example, the classic Led Zeppelin song, Stairway to Heaven. She's buying a stairway to heaven is active voice. Passive voice would reverse that and put the object before the verb. So a stairway to heaven is being bought by her. Grammatically correct, although it sounds weird. And also, it's more wordy because you end up using more words when using passive voice. But like I said, it's not incorrect, and there are certain subjects and disciplines that require the use of passive voice. So, we are all affected by pesticides, is an example of a statement, and passive voice. What's the verb? It's affected. What is being affected? What's the receiver? Us. What is affecting us? The pesticides. So pesticides affect us all would be an example of putting that into active voice. So you would fix passive voice, and I'm not sure fix is the right word here because, again, it's technically not wrong. But you would fix passive voice by making it active, putting the subject before the verb. And I think the best way or the easiest way to do that is to identify what the verb is and then think about, okay, what is performing that action, and then put that before the verb. Whatever the case is, be consistent. So if you're in a field that requires the use of passive voice, make sure that you maintain the use of passive voice. However, there's relatively few fields that require the use of passive voice. So it's best to use active, because active, not only does it just sound better, it sounds more active and more energetic. It's also more concise because you end up using fewer words than in passive voice. And like I said, we tend to naturally speak in active voice. So it sounds more natural to us. So use active voice as a general rule when it comes to writing, especially in an English class. Although be aware that sometimes you will have to use passive voice and you have to sort of train your brain to be able to switch from one to the other. Okay, so the due dates. The first draft of your editorial essay is due at the end of this week, and then the final draft will be due in 2 weeks. So for this first draft, you are now responsible for not just using punctuation and words correctly, but also sentence structure. That is going to be considered as part of the grading criteria. So if you have sentence errors, then that is going to affect your grade. Also, your conclusion should be more than just summaries of your argument. Rather, it should be the summation of the argument. It should be logical, and it should be valid. So that's something that I'm going to be looking for when I read your drafts and ultimately when I grade your final drafts. So you're responsible for knowing those things and being able to use those from this point on. Okay, and that's it for this week. Next week, we will start the final assignment sequence, which will be the proposal paper. So I will talk to you then. Take care and have fun.